Good evening. I believe this is our 10th lesson. Last week we finally turned the corner. We've been doing a lot of preparation, getting a lot of facts under our belt and looking at things from different ways. And so I think we finally got there, and now we're going to begin to put it all together. So last week we did the first part of Jesus, the Son of God, and we asked the question, was he? Because that's the question everybody wants to know if they're doubters. And we reviewed the historical facts. We looked at the claims about Jesus, and we found that the claims about Jesus are absolutely incredible if you think of them in terms of the physical world and the physical universe and the laws of nature. The basic claims are that he existed before the beginning of time, and everything was created through him. Those two things are unusual, to say the least. That he came to earth as God incarnate, that he became one of us, one of his creation, to redeem us because he loves us. Perhaps that's the most difficult thing to believe. That if there were a creator of the whole universe, that he would choose this one little planet and this one little species of animal to come and care about. And the proof that he offers that this is true is his resurrection. And we talked about those things last night, and we talked about some things that have to be accepted. We also reviewed the externally established historical facts concerning Jesus and his life that came to us from non-secular contemporary sources. And we looked at some facts from there that are simply undeniable to anybody, even skeptics. And the three primary ones were that Jesus predicted his death would be by crucifixion. He pointed to his resurrection as the final proof of his deity. And the tomb was empty, and nobody knew where the body was on the third day. Those things are simply undeniable. Tonight, we need to start there, and we begin to look at what happened around leading up to the crucifixion, and the resurrection. And we'll look at the case that's presented in the Scriptures. And we'll reinforce that where it's appropriate with the external facts that we already know. So our approach, as I mentioned last week, is we have shown the incredible historical accuracy and trustworthiness of the New Testament documents, far head and shoulders above anything else from antiquity. And so it makes sense to use these documents in our investigation. Really more so than anything else we could look at. And so we will look at what they have about Jesus of Nazareth, showing, and when I say when available, the corroborating evidence from secular things. Okay, the sequence of events leading up to the crucifixion. And I just want to make you aware of what went on during the week, and we won't cover the whole week, but if he was only a man, Jesus had to be pretty worn out by the end of that week. But we'll begin with the last day, the supper, the night before he was arrested, and the crucifixion, the last supper on the eve of the crucifixion. It says, then came the day of unleavened bread, of which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. When the hour came, Jesus and his disciples reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. No doubt Jesus knew what was coming. Disciples still really don't have a clue. And here is an incredible thing. If this man really was God in the flesh, if he was really the creator of everything we know, and a lot of things we don't know, he got down and washed the feet of his students. got to tell us something about what's expected of us. Then they went to the Garden of Gethsemane after supper. He took the cup and he gave thanks, offered it to them, and he said, "This is the blood of the covenant, my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Of course, the blood of the old covenant was goats and bulls and those sorts of things. He said, then when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And on the Mount of Olives, an interesting event is recorded. It looks like Jesus is having severe reservations about what he has to go through. It says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." And being in anguish, his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. It's interesting, Will Durant notes this, and he says that you have to believe this to be true. He says, despite, and he, you see, is not a Christian, despite the prejudices and theological preconceptions of the evangelist, not that he has any, they record many incidents that mere inventors would have concealed, and no one reading these scenes can doubt the reality of the figure behind them. If you were inventing a God-man and making a myth, you surely would not record this part of it. Then Jesus was arrested in the garden. They went to the place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to the disciples, "The hour has come." Just as he was speaking, Judas appeared, with him a crowd armed with swords and clubs from the chief priests. Going at once, Judas kissed him. Then Jesus is taken by the temple guard to Annas. He is the former high priest. He's the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the present high priest. He's really the power behind everything. And he's the first one to have a shot at Jesus. This is his first trial. An illegal trial, by the way, according to the Jewish law. At this point, Peter loses his courage, his nerve. Peter, who said he would, just a few hours early, he would die for him, wanted to fight with his sword, but the scene has changed, and things appear to be out of control. And the cold, hard fear comes in, and Peter's courage failed him. They said, "Surely you're one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, and he went out and wept bitterly. This is another scene that caught Will Durant's eye and said inventors would have not recorded this. Certainly not about the future supposed head of the church, according to most of the world. Jesus is then taken by the temple guard to Caiaphas to undergo his second trial in front of the current high priest, another illegal trial. And then at dawn, he has to appear before the entire Sanhedrin. The elders, the council of elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, they all met together and condemned Jesus. That's 1, 2, 3 trials, right? Now they take him before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, for a fourth trial. Pontius doesn't want to have anything to do with it. He finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, and that's Herod's responsibility, so he sends him to King Herod, where he undergoes a fifth trial. King Herod wants him to perform tricks for him, and when Jesus refuses, they mock him and make fun of him, and he sends him back to Pilate. Herod doesn't want to have anything to do with him either, and so he comes back to Pilate, And Pilate calls the chief priests and the rulers together, and he said, I have examined him in your presence and found no basis for your charges against him, neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. This is his 6th trial, all within a few hours. The Jews kept shouting, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar. Now, Pilate was not real tight with the powers in Rome, and he had a lot to lose, and this was unnerving to Pilate. So when he heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is called Gabbatha. And interesting, this is one of those places that was not known for many generations. And whenever something like this crops up, Luke is always assumed to be an era. It was found by William F. Albright, and it was the Tower of Antonia, which was appropriately the Roman military headquarters in Jerusalem. And Pilate says, what shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ? And they all shouted, crucify him. So Pilate washes his hands. Actually, it didn't take, did it? History has not been very kind to Pilate. And said, I am innocent of this man's blood. All the people answered, let his blood be on us and on our children. The line that was struck from the Passion. Then Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. And this, of course, was verified by Flavius Josephus, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews in around AD 93. He, of course, was born just 2 or 3 years after the crucifixion. And it was confirmed by Cornelius Tacitus, famous Roman historian. Sequence of events surrounding the crucifixion. Jesus' clothes were divided among the soldiers by casting lots. And we remember that this was also told us in Psalms 22. They divided my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. And the skeptics thought that Matthew and the other writers of the Gospels had fudged a little bit to make this look so close. But you remember Justin Martyr, converted follower of the Greek philosophies. And he says, they pierced my hands and my feet, and the description of the nails, fixed in his hands and his feet on the cross. And after he was crucified, those who crucified him cast lots for his garments. But this was the important part of this. And he's writing to the Emperor Antonius Pius, and he challenges the emperor to check him out. He says, and that these things were so, you may learn from the acts which were recorded under Pontius Pilate. You remember we covered this back when we were looking at the archaeological evidence. And Jesus was then mocked by the Jews. The chief priest and the teachers of the law and the elders mocked him. He trusted in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, I am the Son of God. And Psalms says, all who seek me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. Quote, he trusts in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him, let him deliver him since he delights. Almost verbatim, isn't it? Interesting that the priest fulfilled the prophecy unknowingly. Darkness came over the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. That's much, much, much too long for solar eclipse, which can only be a little over 7 minutes max. So Thalius was incorrect in calling it a solar eclipse, but by arguing against the darkness, he confirms the darkness for us in 52 AD. And then it says, in that day, declares the Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will make that time like morning for an only son, from Amos. Jesus cried out in agony about the 9th hour, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me, which is the introduction of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus died of his own will, a remarkable thing. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And when he had said this, he breathed his last. And when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely this was the Son of God." Jesus' death was verified, and it was verified by a piercing of his side. The Jews didn't want the bodies hanging on the crosses on the Sabbath, so they asked the Romans to go and break the legs of them so that they would suffocate. When they came to Jesus, he was already dead, but they wanted to make sure. You see, Roman soldiers who were derelict in their duty most of the time paid with their life. These guys, first of all, were professional executioners. They knew what a dead man looked like. And we'll talk about this some more later on. But they weren't about to let Jesus come down off of that cross alive. And so they rammed a spear up into his innards, and blood and water ran out. His death was verified. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. That's from Zechariah. And then it's interesting. If we go to Exodus, the lamb used for the Passover, they were not to break the bones. Jesus was the sacrifice for us. It's significant that none of his bones were broken. It was validated, his death was. When Joseph of Arimathea came and asked for the body of Jesus, Pilate was surprised that he was dead already. Sometimes this process took days. And so he asked the Roman centurion, who was the commander over the execution detail, if it were so. And the commander, the centurion, guaranteed the governor that this man was dead. And if you think about it, he would not have taken that question lightly at all. Remember what I said about Roman soldiers. If Jesus showed up somewhere, this man was in deep trouble. Jesus was buried according to Jewish custom. Joseph came and Nicodemus came with him, and they brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, and they wrapped the body up, apparently much like a mummy. You remember when Jesus raised Lazarus? Lazarus had to be helped out of the grave clothes. He couldn't get out by himself. They had to unwind him. So Jesus was buried according to the custom. So that tells us how he was buried. Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb. Turns out it was Joseph's of Arimathea, but it was nearby, and so they put him in it. Nobody had ever used it before. And they put him there because it was the day of preparation, and they didn't have much time. The tomb was closed. Joseph rolled the rock down, and we'll talk about this next week some. It was a special arrangement how they sealed tombs, but it was closed and left for the weekend. It was observed, his burial was. The women who had come down with him from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb, where it was, and even how the body was laid in it. And that'll be important later on also. The women are even identified. It says Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, who was there when he was laid. Sequence of events surrounding the resurrection. The tomb was sealed. The chief priests were no fools. They knew that Jesus had said he was going to be resurrected on the third day as a sign of his messiahship. And now that they put him to death, they certainly don't want him to come back and appear to be the Messiah of God. They've illegally put him to death. So they go to Pilate, the Roman governor, and they ask him to seal the tomb. And again, we're going to get into all of this stuff more in the next 3 weeks. But this tomb was sealed. It was made secure before the third day. by a Roman guard. It's a Roman guard because they went to Pilate to get the guard. On the third day, the tomb was open. Another one of those things you can't deny. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, while it was still dark, one of the other Gospels says, very little light, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome on their way to the tomb, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. So the tomb was open, and we know that on the third day the tomb was empty and the body of Jesus was missing. So Mary Magdalene came running to Simon Peter and the other disciples and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb." It was empty. He wasn't in it any longer, and we don't know where they have put him. They weren't the only ones that didn't know. The risen Jesus was recognized by those who knew him, even Thomas the doubter. When Jesus came back, suddenly appeared in the locked and secured upper room, the same way the sphere did in Flatland, and confronted Thomas. And Thomas's reaction was, "My Lord and my God." He appeared to Peter and then to the 12, and after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me, this is Paul talking, as to one abnormally born. And this was verified by Flavius Josephus. Remember, he said he drew over to his followers saw him again after he was alive. The risen Jesus was the bedrock of the apostles' teachings, simply an undeniable fact. But God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. This is on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles and disciples were speaking in foreign languages and drew a crowd. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this: God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Not only is it the bedrock of the faith, they are actually confronted very directly by it. And the conversions made on the day of Pentecost were a direct result of that confrontation and the facts that the people had witnessed and knew to be true. Many of the contemporary Jews became Christians. Those who accepted the message were baptized. This was Pentecost again. About 3,000 were added that day. Another place, but many who heard the message believed, and the number grew to about 5,000. And so the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests and became obedient to the faith. Priests who originally had Jesus put to death because he was a threat to their way of life and their position in society. Again, verified by Flavius Josephus. Let's look at, before we go forward, think about what we've just been through. The things we talked about, the resurrection is couched in plain, natural, historical facts. If not for the fact that it implies the supernatural resurrection of Jesus, there's not a thing that we read about so far tonight would be doubted. If it were in any other context, for instance, the fact that the rulers went to Pilate and asked that a guard be put on the tomb, that's not remarkable, is it? If you thought somebody was going to try to steal a body and make it appear somebody was resurrected, you'd put a lock on the tomb, make somebody sure somebody was looking at it. All of these things are just natural facts, and it's important to remember that. But the natural facts have to be explained. How did these Jews, who had been in the crucifying mob, who had been there when Jesus was there. They saw him, they witnessed him, they saw the miracles. They were there when he was crucified. And now, 50 days later, 3,000 of them are converted and become followers of Christ on the basis that he's resurrected. These plain, normal, natural, historical facts strongly imply the resurrection in the deity of Christ. And a lot of things have to be explained. What we will do now as we go forward, we will look at some explanations, the way people attack this. And we'll pick some people that should know what they're talking about. But a lot of skeptics have endeavored to deny this, and they struggle with the empty tomb. Since they can't deny the fact that the tomb was empty, it had to be, or there wouldn't be a church, they suggest several things. They'd suggest, first of all, that the New Testament documents are not credible, the so-called Tübingen theory. And if you can get past that off, then you can forget the whole thing. But that's not, we know that's not, can't be argued any longer because it requires many, many generations of oral transmission, and that simply didn't happen because the Gospels and the books were written by the companions of Christ and their companions. They claim that Jesus did not actually die on the cross, the so-called swoon theory, and we'll look at that specifically 2 weeks from now. And various scenarios as how the body of Jesus might have disappeared, such as the wrong tomb and the stolen body theories, and we'll look at those. Some examples of attacks that are all around you. The Passover plot, which we're going to look at in some detail tonight, by Hugh J. Schoenfield. The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, and there was a book, best-selling book and movie just recently on that. The Search for Jesus by Peter Jennings, a news commentator who went to Palestine to find Jesus, and of course he didn't. Jesus in the Gospels by Timothy Johnson. He's a professor at Emory University Seminary. And then the Historical Jesus, a study of Jesus by Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina. He's the chairman, head of the School of Religious Studies. All of these, especially the last two, are very, very destructive, especially when you have a man in a seminary teaching future preachers that we don't know who Matthew is, we don't know who Mark is, and Jesus is kind of this composite guy, we're not too sure about all, and what they base it on. Well, I think it's interesting. We'll look at the Passover plot tonight. Hugh J. Schoenfield wrote it. And here is just a synopsis. It's from the dust cover on the book. It is the moment before sundown in Jerusalem. On the hill of Golgotha, 3 bodies are suspended on crosses. 2, the thieves, are dead. The third appears so. This is the drugged body of Jesus of Nazareth, the man who planned his own crucifixion, who contrived to be given a soporific potion to put him into a death-like trance. Now Joseph of Arimathea, bearing clean linen and spices, approaches and recovers the still form of Jesus. All seems to be proceeding according to plan. Now, if you're a kid and you don't have a very strong basis for your faith, this can be devastating because it's plausible. You see, if you're a naturalist, and we all are to some extent because all of our feedback comes from the physical world, unless we read our Bible and pray a little bit. It's plausible. You have to look beneath the surface to see the holes in it and the weaknesses in it. Hugh Schoenfield, he has a doctor's degree in Bible. He claims to have been a translator of the Bible. He claims to have spent more than 40 years in serious study to write this book, The Passover Plot. I want you to remember that as we go through it. That's a remarkable claim in view of the book. He claims to do Christians a favor by making this hocus-pocus Jesus a believable human to whom they can better relate. And all of this is done under the guise of intellectual academic inquiry. You should know a little bit about Hugh Sconfield. He's Jewish, and this is going to affect his view, his worldview. And we don't want to make a logical fallacy here and reject him on the basis that he's Jewish. But you do need to be aware of what that does to his thinking process. For example, regarding the Messiah, even if he is a believing Jew, which I don't believe he is, the Jewish people look for a Messiah that's quite different from the one that we accept. We accept the Messiah, Jesus, as the Son of God. That's the bedrock of Christianity. The Jews look for a Messiah, something like Moses, not God in the flesh, but God sent. Not God, but God empowered. They look for a man who would come and throw off the yoke of the Romans and make them a great nation again among the nations. That was his mission. Jesus didn't have that mission. So Hugh Sconfield is going to have some problems with his worldview and Jesus. And I just warn you ahead of time. Okay? Here's some quotes, and we will go through here and we'll look at a quote from his book, and then we'll discuss it a little bit. Taking the Gospels together, we have in them the epitome of the process by which the traditions about him, he's talking about Jesus, grew and expanded with the changing needs and fortunes of succeeding generations of believers. What does that sound like to you? We talked about a theory that's been disproven, the Tübingen theory. If the Gospels were written by some of the apostles who were with Jesus and their contemporaries like Mark and Luke, and Paul started writing his gospel, his letters in 51 AD, where is the tradition? Where did that come in? Where did this oral transmission come? And so Jesus, as he appears in them as a composite, remember we talked about that, composite word, and what somewhat contradictory figure, composite. You know, just a conglomerate of all the good people that he came in contact with, stuffed into one individual. Well, the Tübingen theory has been discredited long now, and if he studied 40 years, he surely knows that. So it tells us something about his credibility. After 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life, character, and teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man, so says Will Durant, a non-believer, but a good historian. Hugh Sconfield's not a good historian. Another quote, "We have only what the evangelists report. What little data they had at command now embellished and adorned, totally inadequate to prove anything." Now, I want you to keep that in mind. The Gospels and the other books by the evangelists, totally inadequate to prove anything. Remember I told you Hugh Sconfield is Jewish. And what do we know about the Jewish people down through the centuries after the death of Christ? They weren't very popular, were they? They were blamed for the death of Christ by a lot of people. And only recently, in the past few years, did the Pope actually officially forgive them for that. Look what he does. Yet the oldest traditions in the Gospels witness against the church. Witness against the church. The Gospels testify that the commons of the Jews heard him, Jesus, gladly. We have the evidence from where? We have the evidence that they decided on the removal of Jesus in private conclave. This came from the exact same books that he just said were not fit to prove anything. 40 years of study, PhD in Bible, translator to the Bible. Folks, you just can't believe everything you hear. Where are his data to support the accusation that the Gospels have been embellished and adorned? He made the statement. You know, and you can say, well, I'm pulling these things out and maybe I've taken them. I haven't. If you read the whole book, you won't see any data. He makes all of these statements baseless. No basis whatsoever. You're to accept it because he's Dr. Hugh J. Schoenfield. 40 years of study. What does he have to say about all the supporting data that we have shown to exist? Bibliographical, historical, and archaeological. Absolutely nothing. Will Durant insists that the New Testament is the most accurate document we have from history, from antiquity. This man's off base. Another quote. There's nothing peculiar about the birth of Jesus. He was not God incarnate, and no virgin mother bore him. The church in its ancient zeal fathered a myth. And since Christians largely continue to suppose that their faith stands or falls on the divinity of Christ, the dogma goes on to the detriment of what is really significant about the person and contribution of Jesus. What's a kid going to say about this? Once again, and you'll get tired of hearing this, but where's the beef? There's no data. He's made a statement. But he gives no reason for it. Now, if he studied 40 years, surely he's found something to support it. He doesn't give it. He's simply a victim of his own presupposition, anti-supernaturalism, pure and simple. He's going to make these statements because he doesn't want to believe there's a God incarnate. He has dismissed the virgin birth without so much as a veiled attempt at an explanation and labeled it a myth. Why do we suppose that Jesus, the deity of Christ, is necessary for our faith? Well, the same documents that he's getting all this from Jesus says he's deity. We're told numerous times we have to believe in him. We have to accept him. It's not something that grew out in the church. It was from the beginning. In fact, was that not what was said on the day of Pentecost to the Jews that crucified Christ? 3,000 of whom were converted. What indeed is really significant about Jesus if he's not God incarnate? I don't know if we'll have time in this course to discuss it, but the idea that Jesus was just a good man is just plain silly. It is irrational and illogical and false. We're told of the darkness. The soldiers cast lots for the robe of Jesus. The chief priests and scribes mock him. And he winds up this discussion by saying, there has been invention to obtain a more exact correspondence to the supplement and to supplement the paucity of facts. Well, that's interesting he brings that particular thing out because we know something about that, don't we? Thalius, the antagonist, writing only 19 years after the crucifixion, had to grant us the darkness. He did that by arguing that the darkness that occurred was a solar eclipse. He's wrong, but he gives us the darkness. I'm glad he argued against it. Justin Martyr referred to the Emperor Antonius Pius to the official report filed by Pilate to verify the fact of the casting of lots for his clothes by the soldiers. Now that's not a biblical source, folks. That's the Roman governor. Do you think that somehow Hugh J. Schoenfield missed these things? We may dismiss the story in Matthew alone, not in the other Gospels, that the chief priest suggested a guard be placed at the tomb. Give me a break. Why should we dismiss them? He calls it a fantastic detail added in reply to allegations. Not sure what allegations he's talking about. Again, no evidence. Zero. Are his accusations reasonable? What's unreasonable about him putting a guard at the tomb? What's fantastic about that? Let me ask you, if you were a Jewish leader back then, what would you have done? Faced with a man who claimed that he would be resurrected, raised from the dead on the third day to show that he was God in the flesh, and you had just had him crucified, and you're going to make mighty sure that nobody goes in there and makes it appear that he's been resurrected. Why would you not put a guard at the tomb? I mean, I don't believe these people were idiots. You know, a lot of times people today think we're a lot smarter and more sophisticated than people, 2,000 years ago. Well, they didn't drive automobiles. They rode chariots and horses and donkeys, but they didn't have our technology. But they had the same family problems, the same social problems, the same political problems. They thought like we do. They weren't stupid. And they certainly were smart enough to put a guard at the tomb. Clearly, Mary did not recognize the man she saw as Jesus. We know that she was unbalanced since Jesus had to cast out of her 7 demons. This gets better all the time. Why did Mary not recognize Jesus? Well, as evidence here, he does quote the Bible. Only that Mary has been unstable. But the very same document that he gets that from says that she was cured, doesn't it? Why does he believe that she had 7 demons, but he doesn't believe that they were thrown out of her? Why didn't she recognize Christ? He gives no reason at all. Well, there's some interesting things that are said. In John 20, Mary stood outside of the tomb crying. She has tears in her eyes. It's very early in the morning. The sun's not up yet. It's still, kind of dusky. She turned around and saw Jesus, who she didn't recognize, standing there, but she did not recognize that it was Jesus. Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him. Well, he didn't read far enough. It goes on. Jesus said to her, Mary. Look what she does. She turned toward him. Why didn't she recognize him? She wasn't looking at him. She just glanced and saw somebody out of the corner of her eye. She wasn't even facing him. She did not recognize Jesus until she turned and confronted him face on. She was crying. She wasn't thinking about finding Jesus, and she didn't think that was Jesus, and she was distraught. There's no surprise that she didn't recognize him. From this point on, we're dealing with the accounts of the resurrection as related in the Gospels. I don't know what he was referring to before this. And it has to be seen, now get this, it has to be seen whether they are consistent with our hypothesis. Think about what that says. Now, it's really amazing to me that he puts a sentence like this in his book. He goes on to say, yet we must not treat them as wholly fictitious. They have preserved valuable indications of what transpired. Okay, so they're part false and parts true. How are we going to separate the wheat from the chaff? Well, he admits that some of the accounts are true, but how is he going to determine truth from fable? By his own admission, what agrees with his hypothesis is true, and what disagrees with his hypothesis is false. Now, I don't know what school he got his doctorate in, and I don't know who reviewed his dissertation, but folks, this is very, very unscientific. It's bad history. It's incredibly poor logic. And he admits it. Schoenfield is molding the facts to his hypothesis. Okay. Amazing. We're going to get out a little bit early tonight. Next week, we're going to look at the swoon theory. Did Jesus die on the cross, or did he just faint and fool everybody? This is one of the theories that Schoenfield uses in his story. It's a very popular one as to why the body was missing and the tomb was open and all this. So we'll look at it next week, and we'll also look at the missing body theory and some others. And then the following week we will look at the transformation that the apostles underwent and the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. And then we'll see where we go from there. We got 3 more, right? So I appreciate you coming tonight. Does anybody have any questions since we have a minute or two?